My son-in-law leaned back in his chair at the head of my own dining room table, laughed the particular laugh of a man who believes he's already won, and said the sentence that ended our relationship for good. "Honestly, Frank, you're not even getting anything from this will. You should just be grateful we still let you visit."
He was talking about my late sister's estate, an estate he'd apparently spent months quietly maneuvering around, assuming, incorrectly, that he understood exactly whose name was on every document that mattered. What he didn't know, sitting there in my dining room with that smug, satisfied expression, was that he'd gotten one crucial detail catastrophically wrong.
"I want to tell you exactly what happened over the following 6 weeks, because the look on his face when he finally understood his mistake is something I still think about regularly. And it taught me something important about people who assume confidence is the same thing as being correct. My name is Frank. I'm 72 years old, and this is the story of my son-in-law's confident public announcement that I'd received nothing from my own sister's estate, and the 6 weeks it took for him to discover exactly how wrong he was."
If you've ever been dismissed by someone who assumed they knew more about your own life than you did, stay with me until the end, because this story goes somewhere deeply satisfying, and I think you'll enjoy watching it unfold as much as I enjoyed living through it. And if these kinds of stories matter to you, hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because the full picture matters here more than the dinner table moment itself. My sister, Patricia, was 3 years older than me, and for most of our lives, we were about as close as siblings can be. Closer, I think, than most siblings manage once adulthood scatters everyone across their own separate lives. We grew up in a small house with a mother who worked 2 jobs most of our childhood, and Patricia, being older, took on a kind of quiet responsibility for looking after me that never fully went away, even once we were both well into our 60s and 70s. She used to joke that she'd been practicing being a caretaker since she was 9 years old, walking me to school, making sure I ate something before we left the house, and the habit simply never wore off. Neither of us married particularly young. Patricia, not until her late 30s, to a wonderful man named Julian, who passed away almost a decade before she did. A quiet, thoughtful engineer who I always thought suited her perfectly. And I, not until my early 30s, to my wife Carol, who I lost 6 years ago to complications from a stroke. Patricia and Julian never had children, something Patricia rarely discussed openly, but that I know weighed on her in quieter moments over the decades. And after Julian passed, Patricia leaned on our family more heavily, particularly on my daughter, Rebecca, who she'd always adored since Rebecca was a small girl running around Patricia's garden every summer, helping with the tomato plants in ways that mostly involved uprooting more than she planted, a memory Patricia brought up fondly at nearly every family gathering for the following 3 decades. I want to explain Patricia's financial situation clearly, because it matters enormously to everything that happened. Patricia had built a modest but genuinely successful career as an independent architect, specializing in historic renovation projects across 3 states. She was careful with money, in the particular way people are when they've built everything themselves rather than inheriting it. By the time she passed, at 78, after a relatively brief illness, her estate was worth just over $4 million, a figure that surprised almost everyone in the family, including me. Because Patricia had never once, in decades of conversation, given any indication of exactly how successful her practice had actually become. She lived modestly, drove an aging but well-maintained sedan, and preferred quiet evenings with a book to any display of the wealth she'd quietly accumulated. My daughter Rebecca married a man named Dominic about 7 years ago. I liked Dominic well enough in the early years. He was ambitious, worked in commercial insurance sales, and had a certain confident charm that Rebecca clearly found appealing, even if I sometimes found it a bit much myself. Over the years, though, that confidence curdled into something else, a certainty about his own correctness on almost every subject, that I watched grow more pronounced with each passing year, particularly regarding money and family finances, subjects he seemed to consider himself an expert on, despite,
as far as I could tell, having very little actual expertise beyond his own opinions.
I remember, early in their relationship, actually being somewhat charmed by that confidence myself. Dominic had a way of walking into a room and immediately having an opinion about everything in it, which I initially read as intelligence and drive, rather than what I eventually came to understand it as, a kind of reflexive certainty that had very little to do with whether he'd actually taken the time to understand the subject at hand. Carol, before she passed, was more skeptical of him from the beginning than I was. "He talks like a man who's never once been told he's wrong," she said to me.
"And I worry what happens the first time somebody actually tells him."
Over the years of their marriage, I watched that pattern play out in smaller ways, long before Patricia's estate ever became a factor. Dominic had opinions about how Rebecca should invest her retirement savings, despite having no formal financial training himself. Opinions about which neighborhood they should buy a house in that he delivered with the confidence of a real estate expert. Opinions about how I should have managed my own finances after Carol passed, offered unprompted at a moment when I was still raw with grief and had no particular interest in hearing them. Rebecca, for her part, seemed to have developed a habit of simply absorbing these opinions rather than pushing back, and I sometimes wondered, watching them together, whether some part of her had simply decided, somewhere along the way, that disagreement wasn't worth the friction it would cause. Patricia's health began declining about 18 months before she passed, a slow, difficult decline involving several hospitalizations and eventually home hospice care in her final months. During this period, Dominic became notably more attentive to Patricia than he'd ever been previously, visiting more often, offering to help with paperwork, positioning himself in ways that felt calculated even at the time as someone deeply invested in Patricia's well-being. I noticed during several of these visits, Dominic asking Patricia pointed questions about her estate planning, questions framed as concerned helpfulness, but that struck me even then as reconnaissance. "Have you thought about how everything's structured, Patricia? Rebecca and I would be happy to help you organize things. Make sure everything's clear for the family." Patricia, gracious as always, would thank him for his concern and change the subject, never fully engaging with the specifics, though I noticed she never fully dismissed him either, and I wondered at the time whether some part of her simply found it easier not to argue with a man who clearly enjoyed being right. About 8 months before Patricia passed, during one particularly difficult hospital stay, Dominic made an offhand comment at a family dinner that I remember with unusual clarity, given how casually he delivered it. "You know, once Patricia's estate settles, we should really think about consolidating everything as a family. It doesn't make sense for the money to be split up in confusing ways when we could structure it more efficiently together." I asked him what he meant by structured together. He waved off the question, saying it was just general financial planning talk, nothing to worry about yet. Looking back, I can trace my own passivity in those months to a familiar, comfortable habit of giving people the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt had stopped being reasonable. I want to be honest about something. At the time, I assumed Dominic's confidence about the estate came from actual knowledge, that Patricia had shared details with Rebecca and Dominic that she simply hadn't shared with me, her own brother. It didn't occur to me in those months that Dominic might simply be assuming things based on incomplete information and his own overconfident interpretation of family dynamics. Patricia passed in early autumn, peacefully, at home with Rebecca and me both present in her final days. The three of us in that quiet bedroom with the afternoon light coming through curtains she'd sewn herself decades earlier. A detail I remember more clearly than almost anything else from that period. The way grief sometimes fixes itself on small, unimportant things rather than the enormity of the moment itself. Her final words to me, spoken barely above a whisper, were about a box of old photographs in her hall closet. Nothing about money, Nothing about the estate, just a request that I make sure Rebecca got the photographs of her own childhood before anyone else went through the house. In the weeks following her funeral, as is often the case, the practical matters of an estate began to surface. The reading of the will, the settling of accounts, the various logistics that follow even the most carefully planned death. This is where I need to explain something crucial that I hadn't fully appreciated myself until Patricia's attorney contacted me directly about 3 weeks after the funeral, requesting a private meeting.
Patricia, it turned out, had updated her will substantially about 4 years before her death, following a decision she'd made after watching several of her architecture colleagues struggle with poorly structured estates that caused years of family conflict after their deaths. She'd hired a specialized estate attorney, a meticulous woman named Counselor Grant, and together they'd built a structure that, as Counselor Grant explained to me in that private meeting, was considerably more sophisticated than a simple direct inheritance will.
Counselor Grant walked me through the structure slowly, patiently, clearly having anticipated that I might need a moment to absorb what she was describing. The bulk of Patricia's estate, approximately $3.2 million, had been placed into a trust, not distributed directly to any single family member, but structured with specific provisions, distributions, and crucially, a designated trustee, responsible for overseeing the trust's administration according to Patricia's detailed wishes for the following 2 decades, wishes involving educational funding for future grandnieces
and grandnephews, ongoing support for a historic preservation nonprofit Patricia had quietly funded for years, and staged distributions to family members timed to specific life milestones rather than one immediate lump sum. And the trustee Patricia had named, the person with legal authority and responsibility over that $3.2 million trust for the next 2 decades, was me.
I want to tell you what I felt sitting in Counselor Grant's office, because it wasn't triumph, not at first. It was something closer to disbelief, followed by a kind of quiet grief, understanding that my sister had trusted me with something this significant, without ever fully discussing it with me directly. Perhaps, I suspect now, because she knew exactly how differently that conversation might have gone if certain other family members had gotten wind of it beforehand. I sat in that office for a long time after Counselor Grant finished explaining the structure, staring at a framed architectural rendering on her wall, one of Patricia's own historic renovation projects, a Victorian library restoration Patricia had been especially proud of. I remember thinking in that moment about how much of my sister's life I'd apparently never fully understood. Not just the scope of her financial success, which had genuinely surprised me, but the depth of thought she'd put into protecting her legacy from exactly the kind of casual overreach that Dominic, without ever
fully articulating it even to himself, had clearly been circling for months. Counselor Grant explained the reasoning Patricia had shared with her during the drafting process. Patricia had grown concerned in her final years about Dominic's increasing interest in family finances, an interest she found, in her own words as recorded in her planning notes, more focused on control than on care. She'd structured the trust specifically to ensure that no single family member, particularly not someone married into the family rather than born into it, could exert direct influence over how the estate would be managed or distributed. She'd named me trustee, not because I was
owed anything specific from the estate personally, but because she trusted my judgment, my patience, and, as Counselor Grant put it, your demonstrated ability to keep a confidence, Frank, which apparently mattered enormously to your sister.
I didn't share any of this with the family immediately. Counselor Grant advised a measured, deliberate approach to disclosure, partly for legal reasons involving the formal trust administration process, and partly, I think, because some part of both of us recognized that Dominic's reaction, whenever it came, was likely to be significant. She suggested gently
that I take a few days simply to sit with the news myself before deciding how or when to share it, advice I took gratefully, spending that first weekend largely alone, walking through Patricia's old neighborhood, trying to reconcile the sister I thought I knew completely with the version of her who had apparently been quietly protecting my future for years without ever once mentioning it directly. The dinner where Dominic made his comment happened about 2 weeks after that private meeting with Counselor Grant, before any formal disclosure had been made to the wider family. Rebecca had organized a family dinner at my house, ostensibly to discuss next steps regarding Patricia's estate, though I noticed even before the meal started that Dominic had arrived with a particular energy, a barely contained eagerness that I understood, in hindsight, as the confidence of a man who believed he already knew exactly how the conversation would unfold. Partway through dinner, Dominic brought up the estate directly, addressing the table with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. Look, I think we should just be practical about this. Rebecca is obviously going to be the primary beneficiary here, given she's Patricia's actual niece. And honestly, Frank, you're not even getting anything from this will. You should just be grateful we still let you visit. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment, the way I had to sit with it at my own dinner table. Let you still visit. As though the house I was sitting in wasn't mine. As though visiting my own niece, my late sister's memory, required some kind of permission from her husband. I didn't respond immediately. I want to explain why, because I think the delay mattered. I finished my meal, engaged in the rest of the evening's conversation with what I hoped came across as calm, unbothered patience, and I said nothing about the trust, about my role as trustee, about the $3.2 million whose administration now rested legally in my hands rather than his. I want to describe that dinner in a bit more detail before moving forward, because I think the specific texture of it matters. It was a Sunday evening, about 6 people around my table, myself, Rebecca, Dominic, and 3 of Patricia's oldest friends who Rebecca had thoughtfully invited to share memories and help plan a small memorial gathering. Dominic had spent much of the meal steering conversation, subtly but unmistakably, toward the subject of next steps for the family, a phrase he used at least 3 times before finally making his declaration about the will. I noticed, even as he spoke, several of Patricia's friends exchanging a quick, uncomfortable glance across the table. The particular look of people who sense something is being said that shouldn't be said quite so confidently, quite so publicly, at what was still, fundamentally, a gathering to remember someone we'd all just lost. I want to tell you what happened over the following 6 weeks, because watching it unfold was more satisfying than any single confrontation could have been. The formal trust administration process began about a week after that dinner, with Counselor Grant sending the required legal notifications to all named beneficiaries and interested parties, myself included as trustee. Dominic, as Rebecca's husband rather than a blood relative or named beneficiary himself, received a courtesy notification as Rebecca's spouse, informing the family of the trust structure and identifying me as the appointed trustee responsible for its administration. Rebecca called me the evening those notifications went out, her voice carrying a complicated mixture of emotions I could hear clearly even over the phone, something between disbelief and a kind of cautious hope she seemed almost afraid to fully voice out loud. "Dad," she said, "Dominic just read the letter about 8 times. I don't think he fully understands what it means yet, but I think he's starting to." Understanding arrived fully about 4 days later, when Dominic showed up at my house unannounced, a version of him I'd never quite seen before. Not the confident, dismissive man from that dinner table, but someone considerably more careful, more measured, clearly having spent several days processing exactly what my role as trustee actually meant for the family's financial future. He'd apparently spent part of that time researching trust law on his own, Rebecca told me later, staying up late several nights reading through articles about trustee authority and beneficiary rights, trying.
"Frank," he said, standing in my doorway, "I think we should talk about the trust. I want to make sure everyone's on the same page about how distributions will work going forward."
I invited him in, made coffee the way I always had for guests, regardless of the circumstances, and let him sit with the reality of the situation for a few minutes in silence before I spoke. "Dominic," I said, "I want to be clear about something. As trustee, I have legal responsibility to administer this trust according to Patricia's specific wishes, as documented extensively with her attorney over the 4 years before she passed. That includes staged distributions tied to specific milestones, ongoing funding for a nonprofit she cared deeply about, and educational provisions for any future
grandnieces or grandnephews Rebecca might have. It does not include consolidating family finances, and it does not include any direct authority for you specifically over how any of this is managed." I watched something shift in his expression, the particular collapse of a man realizing that months of quiet assumption had been built on a foundation that simply didn't exist. "I just think," he started, "that as Rebecca's husband, I should have some input into decisions that affect our household." "You're welcome to discuss household finances with Rebecca," I said. "That's between the two of you. But Patricia's trust isn't a household finance decision. It's a legal structure she built specifically with a specialized attorney over 4 years, naming me as trustee for reasons she documented clearly. I'd encourage you not to mistake being married into this family for having authority over decisions my sister made deliberately outside of your reach. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because the resolution here was gradual rather than a single dramatic moment."
Dominic's behavior shifted noticeably in the weeks after that conversation. Not immediately humble, I want to be honest about that, but considerably more careful, considerably less inclined to make sweeping declarations at family dinners about matters he didn't actually understand. Rebecca, for her part, told me privately several weeks later that the entire situation had prompted some genuinely difficult conversations in their marriage, conversations about control, about assumption, about the particular pattern Dominic had developed over their 7 years together of speaking with.
"I think he's embarrassed," Rebecca told me, sitting in my kitchen about 2 months after the initial dinner. "Not just about being wrong about the will, about how confidently wrong he was, in front of the whole family, about something this significant."
There was one more conversation I want to tell you about. One that happened privately between Dominic and me, about 6 weeks after that initial exchange at my door. He called and asked if he could come by, alone, without Rebecca, and I agreed, curious what he might want to say without her present. He sat in my living room, considerably more subdued than I'd seen him at any point in 7 years of knowing him, and told me he'd been doing a lot of thinking. "I think I've spent most of my marriage assuming I understood things I actually didn't," he said. "Not just about the trust, about a lot of things. I think I got comfortable being the person who always had an answer, and I stopped noticing when I didn't actually have one." He paused for a long moment before continuing. "I owe you an apology for what I said at that dinner. Not because of what it turned out to mean legally, because it was a cruel thing to say to someone in his own house, and I said it because I was certain I was right, and I wasn't even curious enough to check." I appreciated that apology more than I expected to, not because it undid the moment itself, but because it suggested something I hadn't been sure Dominic was capable of, genuine self-reflection, rather than simply strategic recalibration once his assumptions had been proven wrong. I administered the first distributions from Patricia's trust about 4 months after her passing, according to the schedule she'd carefully outlined with Counselor Grant years earlier. At that formal meeting, held in Counselor Grant's conference room with all named beneficiaries present, Rebecca received a substantial distribution,
exactly as Patricia had intended, timed to coincide with a milestone Patricia had specifically noted in her planning documents, Rebecca's upcoming 40th birthday, a date Patricia had apparently remembered and planned around years in advance, a detail that moved
both Rebecca and me to tears when Counselor Grant read it aloud during the formal distribution meeting. Counselor Grant told us that Patricia had actually revised that specific provision twice over the 4 years of planning, once to adjust the amount, and once, more touchingly, simply to add a handwritten note to be read aloud at the distribution, a short message about how proud she was of the woman Rebecca had become, and how she hoped this gift would give her room to pursue whatever she wanted next in life, unburdened by the practical worries that so often narrow a person's choices.
Rebecca kept that note, had it framed, and it now hangs in her home office, the first thing she sees most mornings. Dominic attended that meeting, considerably quieter than he'd been at any point in the process, and I noticed, watching him listen to the careful, deliberate structure Patricia had built, that something in his understanding of the entire situation had genuinely shifted. Whatever confidence had allowed him to declare so casually that I'd get nothing from a will he'd never actually seen, seemed to have been replaced with something closer to appropriate humility about the limits of what he actually knew. At one point during that meeting, when Counselor Grant explained the provision for the Historic Preservation Nonprofit, Dominic actually raised his hand, almost sheepishly, to ask a clarifying question rather than offer an opinion, and I remember Rebecca glancing at me across the table, with an expression somewhere between amusement and quiet relief, the two of us silently acknowledging a small but genuine shift in a man neither of us had expected to see change quite so visibly.
I think about that dinner table moment often, not with lingering anger, but with a kind of quiet satisfaction that has less to do with vindication and more to do with what it revealed about the difference between confidence and correctness. I think, too, about Patricia and the particular kind of foresight it took to build protections into her estate years before anyone in the family had any reason to think they'd be needed. The quiet, careful work of someone who understood, long before the rest of us did, that love sometimes requires structure as much as it requires sentiment. Dominic spent months assuming authority over information he'd never actually verified, speaking with certainty about a will he'd never seen, structured by an attorney he'd never met. According to wishes my sister had spent 4 careful years documenting specifically to protect against exactly the kind of casual overreach he'd been quietly planning.
If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been dismissed by someone who assumed they understood your circumstances better than you did, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened at the formal establishment of the Historic Preservation Scholarship Fund Patricia specifically requested, and whether Dominic finally learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions, that's a story too. Let me know.
One last thing worth mentioning. Counselor Grant told me at that same distribution meeting something Patricia had said to her during their very first planning session 4 years before her death that I hadn't heard until that day. Patricia had apparently told her, almost as an aside, "My brother has spent his whole life being underestimated by people who talk faster than they think. I'd like this to be the one time it finally works out entirely in his favor." I don't know exactly what she meant by that, whether it was about Dominic specifically or simply a broader pattern she'd noticed over the decades of watching how people treated me. But I've carried that sentence with me since. A small, private gift from a sister who apparently understood me and loved me, more precisely than I ever fully realized while she was still here to tell me so herself. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.